Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Section 6 of his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume is considering the topic of probability. The section is titled Of Probability. And if your understanding of probability is primarily oriented around what we nowadays call probability and statistics, and very much along the lines of mathematics, you're going to want to think in a somewhat broader sense that the term actually has, not only in Hume's own time, but also in our own time as well, where the probability is, it can be something that's a measure, but it can also be something that we could say is felt. It's really sort of a modality of things. When we say something is merely probable, we're not just saying that it's purely possible, we're also not saying that it's absolutely necessary, but it's somewhere in between there. Sometimes we can give numbers for it based on some sampling. Sometimes it's more of a sense that we have, like, well, I think this is likely, but, you know, if I had to give it a number, I don't know, somewhere between 65 and 80%, right? So there's a lot of things that we consider to be probable. And Hume begins this in a very interesting way. He tells us that there really is no chance. There's no such thing as chance in the world. So, he's beginning by talking about something that's going to play a role in what follows, the probability of chance. But he tells us there really isn't any such thing. What's actually going on? Our ignorance of the real cause of any event has the same influence on the understanding and begets a like species of belief or opinion. So what he's really saying there is that all of our thoughts that some things happen randomly, by chance, and there could be probabilities assigned to something like the roll of a dice, but it's totally random how it works. He's saying that all of that is really imaginary on our part. And it could be part of a collective imagination. He doesn't consider that possibility. Or it could be the individual human being's imagination. But there is no such thing as absolute randomness. Now that's kind of a startling thing for somebody who's just spent all these chapters before that saying, well, we don't really know the causes of things to assert with such, such confidence. But I suppose you could find an argument for that, although he's not really providing one for that degree of confidence that he has. Then he distinguishes two different kinds of probability. And the first is probability, which is, he says, arising from a superiority of chances on any side. And what we should say here is perceived or imagined superiority of chances. And then he says, according as this superiority increases and surpasses the opposite chances, the probability receives a proportional increase and begets a still higher degree of belief or assent to that side in which we discover the superiority. And this makes good sense, because belief is not something that's all or nothing for Hume. It is a feeling, right? It's a sentiment. And so the more certain we feel about something, the more strongly we believe in it, or the more strongly we feel that sentiment that we call belief. And so if we think about the example of the sides of a dice that he likes, this is a very easy, intuitive one. Think about a single die, and it's got numbers from 1 to 6 on it, right? You've probably used these in board games, or you've seen them on computer modelings. You throw the dice. What is the chance that any one single number is going to come up? If you say anything other than 1 in 6, I'd like to know the reason why, because most of us would say, well, there's six faces. Any one of them could come up, so therefore it's a 1 in 6 chance. What if you label two sides of the die with the same number? So there's 2 1s, and then there's a 2, 3, 4, and a 5. Well, then 1 becomes twice as probable, right? And if you throw the die, you'll say, well, I'm not believing that it's necessarily going to come up 1. There's only actually a 1 in 3 chance of that, but that's a lot stronger than coming up 5 or 2. And similarly, if we throw 2 dice, what's the most common number? 7, because there's 6 combinations, right? Out of 36, so 1 in 6 chance, whereas rolling a 2 or rolling a 12, you got a 1 in 36 chance. Now, we can do all that sort of stuff mathematically, and that would be, what Hume is calling relations of ideas in other parts. It's quite simple to do, and we can imagine to ourselves that that's the way things are going to work. Now, in reality, no die is absolutely perfect. There's going to be like a little bit more weight on one side than on another, perhaps just because of the drilling the holes into it, or the die gets worn in certain ways. But we don't fully understand all these things unless we're the ones who are skewing the die. We're rolling what we call loaded dice. So he says that the process of the thought or reasoning may seem trivial or obvious, but to those who consider it more narrowly, that is, more closely, it may afford matter for curious speculation. It seems evident when the mind looks forward to discover the event which may result from the throw of such a die, it considers the turning up of each particular side as alike probable, right? So he says this is the very nature of chance, to render all the particular events comprehended in it equally, entirely equal. Now, he says that the concurrence of these several views or glimpses imprints an idea more strongly on the imagination, gives it superior force and vigor, renders its influence on the passions and affections more sensible, and in a word, begets that reliance or security which constitutes the nature of belief and opinion. When we imagine that the likelihood is approaching, every single time it's going to come up this way. And that's really all that he has to say about the probability arising from perceived chances. I mean, the one thing that we can say is there is no real chance. So this is purely imaginary, but it could derive to some degree from experience. You could roll a bunch of dice. If somebody actually doubts it, have them do that sort of experiment. People are not particularly good at that. I think there's a lot of people who tend to think that they can have some sort of influence on the spin of a roulette wheel or the throw of a dice or what's going on with cards. And that's why a lot of people lose money at gambling. There's other reasons as well. Now, probability of causes. This, Hume thinks, is actually real. So this describes something that happens with us human beings. And he says, listen, there's some things where the connections, remember, causality for Hume is constant connection, right? Or constant conjunction. They're uniform and constant. So he gives the example of gravity as a prime case. Gravity could turn off. It's possible, that even though we've observed it happening all the time throughout our life, that it could work differently, in the next minute. That's conceivable, but nobody expects that that's going to happen. We give it a probability of 1, meaning that it's going to happen in every case. He also asserts, and this makes sense in his time, that fire has always burned, water suffocated every human creature. We could find some interesting exceptions. Somebody walks through a fire, doesn't get burned. We're like, oh, look at that case over there. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to expect that when we put our own hand in the fire, it's not going to burn our hand, or that if we immerse ourselves underwater, that we're not going to drown, right? So, as a matter of fact, you could say that people murdering is based on the supposition that stuff is actually going to work. So, some of these connections are very, very likely. He says that there's other causes which have been found more irregular and uncertain. So he gives two interesting medical examples. Opium is a soporific. It makes people go to sleep, in part because they're high, right? But it doesn't always affect everybody in exactly the same way. Rhubarb, he says, rhubarb is not always proved to purge, but it will in most cases. And then he says, okay, well, what happens when things don't work that way? When, for example, I take a sip of my coffee and I'm like, I put some cream into my coffee. This is going to make it taste better for me because I like the fat and the sweetness and all that, along with the bitterness of the coffee. And I take it, this is awful, right? I spit it out. Well, I start looking for other reasons. Or, I could doubt that cream has a certain taste in general, but that's not usually where I go. And he talks about philosophers. The philosophical attitude towards this will be to assume, well, there's other things going on. Again, we don't fully understand the causality at work. The causality could be complex. So maybe the cream was off that day, right? Or maybe I got a bad batch, or maybe we could go on and on and on with all sorts of examples. Maybe there's something in that particular coffee that interacted with the cream, which is perfectly normal, in a weird way. So he says that philosophers don't ascribe this to any irregularity in nature, but suppose that some secret causes in the particular structure of parts have prevented the operation. So, like, fire didn't burn, right? Somebody, we would start looking and say, well, what's going on with that person's body, or what's going on with that fire? Now, he doesn't think that most people approach probability in this philosophical or scientific way. He says that what we do instead, he says, our reasonings are the same as if this principle had no place. Being determined by custom to transfer the past to the future in all inferences, where the past has been entirely regular and uniform, we expect the event with greatest assurance and leave no room for any contrary supposition. The sun will rise. I might not see it because there's clouds, but I don't doubt that there's a sun there. If someday the sun goes out, well, we're screwed if it does. We won't be doing philosophy very long. But if it were to go out and we were to somehow stay alive, well, then we would start to consider it to be just probable and not absolutely certain. Then he says, where different effects have been found to follow from causes which are to appearance exactly similar, all these various effects must occur to the mind in transferring the past to the future and enter into our consideration when we determine the probability of the event. And so here we're talking about not certainty, but probability. Though we give the preference to that which has been found most usual, notice that term, and believe that this effect will exist, we must not overlook the other effects, but must assign to each of them a particular weight and authority in proportion as we found it to be more or less frequent. He gives the example of snow or frost in January. And it's a very interesting example because he says, okay, so on any given January day, you can expect that there's going to be frost. Now remember, too, he's writing up in Scotland, which on the one hand, is quite far north, but on the other hand, is getting the warming effect at some degree of the sea, right? So, if we're thinking about January and we're thinking about Scotland, then we can say, there's a pretty high probability there's going to be snow or frost on the ground, right? We go further south, say to Italy, maybe not. Probably fairly unlikely. Or we go to, North Africa. Well, I suppose it could happen there. It snows in Texas sometimes, but it's really unlikely, Here in Wisconsin, if, we're in January, now it's interesting here because global warming has changed the climate in this state where I grew up. If you were to ask me when I was a kid, hey, is it going to be cold and snowy and frozen over in January? I'd be like, yeah, of course. Look around. What's it been like every year? We've had some days where it's actually been quite spring-like in January here in Milwaukee. And everybody's like, wow, this is really strange. This is unseasonable. It's possible the weather people are not totally surprised by it. The rest of us are. And why? Because we're working with kind of old data from our old customs and habits. And he says this probability varies according to the different climates and approaches to a certainty in more northern kingdoms. And he says, here, then, it seems evident when we transfer the past to the future in order to determine the effect which will result from any cause, we transfer all the different effects in the same proportion as they've appeared in the past and conceive one to have existed 100 times, for instance, another 10 times, another once. And he says, all these views concur in one event. They fortify and confirm it to the imagination, beget that sentiment which we call belief, and give its object the preference above the contrary event, which is not supported by an equal number of experiments and recurs not so frequently to the thought in transferring this from the past to the future. So what's going on here is we're sort of carrying around all these memories of past experiences, what he calls experiments, and we project onto the present and the future what we've seen in the past. We project it to a certain degree with a certain amount of probability that then we feel as belief. So there's some things where we might say, I don't have a high degree of confidence in this. I mean, it could happen, but I don't really know. And then there's other things where we're like, yeah, of course it's going to go that way. I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 99.9% sure, we say. We're usually overestimating the degree of probability in those sorts of cases. When somebody says they're 99.9% sure, odds are they aren't. So that's a fitting place to bring this to a close. Hume needs to bring this up because when it comes to causality, there are some cases where we do have constant conjunction, but there are so many other cases where we don't actually observe that, and what we see instead is, this case happens more often, this case happens less often, and we assign a higher probability and a lower probability on that basis.